Okay. I'm going to give a brief overview of some workflows that we use in our product development process. So we use biomechanical simulation in a lot of different parts of the product development cycle or design cycle. Obviously, early product development is an ideal place for simulation. We are trying to shift our use of simulation left in our product development cycle. I think historically, we've often used it more for failure analysis to see what went wrong with the product, as opposed to like seeing what could go wrong with the product earlier in the development cycle. Regulatory submission, obviously, Mark touched on this earlier. We have lots of guidance now on how to report simulation and how the regulatory bodies will accept simulation data. So we've been using B&V 40 and the new FDA guidance pretty extensively in our development process. Marketing study, I think we all like making pretty heat maps, so that's another area. And you know, the fun academic work when we get to work with external labs and universities to develop biomechanical workflows and new test methods. And then, as I mentioned, failure analysis. Again, there's a lot of questions you can ask with these workflows, and the specific path you take will depend on your question of interest and in the context of use of your model. How are you using your model? What's the model risk? And what is your validation space? So there's a lot going on in this picture. I mean, this is just kind of generally things that we do at Diffuse Synthese. I mean, there's a lot of different types of modeling you can do. You can start with statistical shape modeling for trauma implants, for example. We do a lot of statistical analyses of bones, try to get a good fit, look at screw trajectories. But again, that's more like a design simulation. And then we can go into actually evaluating how that performs physiologically. We can do some material mapping if we have CT data to develop a biomechanical bone model. We use a lot of musculoskeletal modeling, such as antibody technology, to map physiological loads to the bone as well. And then there's other things you can do, such as look at bone failure modeling. And then you can't forget about the standards, because those are often part of regulatory submissions. I'm going to go into one specific example here from a project I recently worked on. So this is stress shielding in shoulder implant. Historically, I've worked on trauma products, but more recently I've been working in the joint space as well as the spine space. But marketing had a question to look at stress shielding in bone for two different implants. When bone is not mechanically stimulated, it degrades. It's kind of a use it or lose it situation. You can see in the images proximal in that bone, you have a lot of bone degradation resulting from the stiff implant not allowing the bone to be mechanically stimulated. So we wanted to look at how stress shielding varied between these two implants to answer a marketing question, and then compare the relative differences in that stress shielding using bone volume below a certain strain threshold as kind of a surrogate for stress shielding. In this case, we only looked at release of product, and we're only considering nominal implant insertion. For our bone, we actually didn't use internal tools. We partnered with the AO. It's a surgeon expert group in Davos, Switzerland. Synthes has historically worked pretty closely with the AO. We had a subject population to develop a mean statistical shape, and this also included the volumetric data, so we could get an estimate of the material properties by converting the grayscale values to Young's modulus. We only looked at average shape in this particular study, but there's certainly other shapes we could have investigated. For loads, in this case, we looked at Bergman data. So there's a lot of instrumented implant data from Bergman and others. This case, we're looking at joint contact forces in the shoulder for various activities of daily living. So we didn't want to just look at one activity. Obviously, your arm does a lot of things throughout the course of the day. So we looked at activities that had low and high off-axis loading components. Most of the load goes through the axis of the bone, but then we chose high and low off-axis components to get a feel for the loading space. And you can see on the screen, just automate where possible. I think these models are initially hard to set up the first iteration, but if you're smart about it, you can quickly iterate through many different cases. So if we look at the stress shielding here for these 6 activities, I think it's kind of interesting. If you look at activity 4, for example, we picked a strain threshold that we found in the literature for most of the bone was below that strain threshold, but that was a low magnitude loading activity. And you can see for the various activities, you have varying degrees of shielded bone based on how the magnitude and direction of that load. What we really wanted to do is go beyond an N=1 study here. I mean, I don't think one activity really gives you a full picture of what's going on. So what we did was we looked at the volume of strain below our specified strain threshold for all 6 of those activities, which is the image you can see on the right. So you can see, most of the shielding is proximal, which you would expect, and that represents a much broader range of motion as opposed to just considering one specific activity from the set that we investigated in this study. There were some limitations to this study. Again, we only looked at nominal insertion angle and a mean bone, mean properties. Obviously, we could have looked at osteoporotic bone or 5th or 95th percentile bones, depending on what the worst case would be. We didn't get into subject-specific modeling or look at high strain thresholds. Strain above a certain threshold obviously is not good either. There's a sweet spot of strains you're trying to target. Again, the context of use is going to dictate the complexity of your modeling approach, and that parameter matrix could be quite large, so you want to limit that where possible. Just going back, here's just a reminder of where we've been through this workflow. Again, we didn't use this whole process for this one specific use case. You'll notice the standards in there. Again, you can't forget about the standards because you're always going to have to pass those tests for regulatory submission. And then there's also the failure modeling, which we didn't discuss. In some cases, we do some modeling of the bone, look at what the loading is in the screw, and then look at, for example, screw pull-out and sort of a high-fidelity submodel. So there are definitely other things you could consider or simulate using this approach. Again, don't forget about the standards because we need those for most of our submissions. I think these are actually relatively easy to validate because we have a large amount of validation data just through all of our manufacturing sites. I mean, it can be hard to mine that data, but we have relatively tight bands on that data relative to, say, a biomechanical modeling approach. I mean, if you want, I think everybody has a little bit different definition of what a digital twin is. I mean, how far do you want to take this process? You can go all the way back to 3D printing the implants or looking at various other manufacturing steps. For example, in trauma, we often forge our plates, which adds residual stress to the implant blank. We have some manufacturing bending steps for some trauma products. The surgeons bend our products, which is within the surgeons are allowed to bend our implants, but obviously that's going to add more residual stress to the implant. So how is that affecting the product performance? And then how does that tie back into the full biomechanical workflow? Again, context of use is everything. What's your validation space, and how do these workflows flow back and forth within each other depending on your validation space and context of use? So there are a lot of opportunities to use the biomechanical workflows. I mean, I really just touched on one example here. It all depends on how you're going to use your model and what your validation space is. So there's a lot of obviously different things to consider as you're developing these very specific workflows for your use cases. So thanks for your time and attention. Privilege for the opportunity to present today, and I'll take any questions if you have any.
And we have time for a question.
I have one question regarding the stress shielding for the shoulder implant. I mean, if you put it in a shoulder implant, you usually have some deficiency in your also muscle structure often. Not that much in this type of implant, even more in the inverse implant. If you only go for the bone, is that sufficient in these cases, or putting the other way around? If you go into implants or deficiencies, do we have to include more of that particular structures or models into that?
You're saying like the specific ligament loads and muscles. Yeah, I would say this was a pretty relatively simplified approach using just the joint contact force. We do have full musculoskeletal modeling approaches where you could, remove ligaments or kind of change the locations of attachment points to get a more realistic loading case. But for this particular example, we thought that the joint contact force was sufficient to answer the marketing question. So.
But just a question in general, would it be important to include specific models for the pathologies if you use that kind of approaches?
Within like the full workflow, like, yeah.
You usually have to deal with people who have some deficiencies in their implant structures or whatever. So also if you go to hip implants or whatever.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it's also tricky collecting that specific, I don't know what you want to call it, injured patient data. I think it's relatively easy to come across the normal data, but I think that's something we struggle with. And I mean, is that injured data going to be lower? Are the loads going to be lower than a normal patient? Sometimes I would say no, because I think there's papers showing people compensate differently, which could actually increase the load in that specific environments. But yeah, those data sets are hard to come by. I think that's why we have academic partners sometimes to try to improve the fidelity of our modeling approach, if that makes sense. Yeah.